All right, guys, welcome to class here for Wednesday. And now we're diving into our next tissue, which is connective tissue. Last class, we talked about the histology and tissue in general, and then we moved into epithelial tissue, talked about both types of epithelial tissue. And now we're going to dive into our next tissue, which is called connective tissue. Okay, so a few features of connective tissue here. It is by far the most abundant tissue in the body. Its main functions are strength and support, protection, insulation, and transportation of substances around the body. Okay, strength and support. Example of that is our bone. Bone is an example of connective tissue. Protection, example of that is our bone, our skin, our fat. Okay, part of our skin is epithelial, part of it is connective tissue. Insulation, adipose tissue, also called fat. Okay, and then transportation of substances around the body. You probably guessed it, that's our blood. Our blood is considered a tissue. It's considered connective tissue. Okay, the features of connective tissue are different than epithelial tissue in that they have degrees of vascularity. Some are have a super rich blood supply. Some don't have any blood supply at all. So very rich blood supply, obviously, would be the blood itself, but outside of that, adipose tissue, fat, is very, very vascularized, and bone is also extremely vascularized. Okay, poor blood supply would be our denser tissues like our cartilage. Cartilage has a very, very low blood supply. In some areas, no blood supply. Okay, so this is composed of primarily non-living substances, whereas epithelial tissue is almost all cells, right, and very little extracellular matrix. Connective tissue is almost the opposite, where it's almost all extracellular matrix with just a few cells scattered around. So the common elements that we find within all types of connective tissue include protein fibers. Okay, so fibrous proteins found in the extracellular matrix. What is that extracellular matrix? Again, remember, it's the space around cells. Okay, and then the cells that we find in connective tissue can be typically immune cells, blood cells, fat cells, bone cells, etc. We'll look at some of and then also the cells that actually make the extracellular matrix, the ones that make those tissues, the fibers, I mean. Okay, so let's look at those fibers first. There's three main types. Collagen is the first one. So this is by far the most common protein in the body. Okay, 1/3 to 1/4 of our total body protein is made up of collagen. Okay, so 6% of our body weight is protein. So how heavy is our collagen? All of us have about 3 to 4 pounds of collagen. The average weight of a person would have about 3 to 4 pounds of collagen in the body. Okay, collagen is made up of ropes of 3 strands. Okay, and these spontaneously wind around each other. And you can kind of see that here. See those 3 strands? That's just in one. And then those 3 strands wind around each other here. And then those bigger fibrils will wrap around more bigger fibrils until we get our big, thick bands of collagen. They're incredibly strong tensile strength, which means we pull end to end on that collagen incredibly hard to break it. Okay, so it resists being pulled apart. These are called white fibers because they show up white under the microscope. They are flexible, which means they can stretch a little bit, but they don't tend to bounce back very strong. Okay, so if we kind of extrapolate the size of these fibers out to be the size of a steel cable, these are much stronger than a steel cable. Okay, so if we can match the size of steel to this is much stronger than that. Okay, so fiber number 2 are called the elastic fibers. Okay, so these elastic fibers are long, thin fibers forming kind of these branching networks. Okay, so the main protein inside is elastin instead of collagen. Okay, so these are really coiled up like a spring in a random fashion. Okay, so that when they're coiled up like that, we stretch them. That means they bounce back. Okay, so they can be stretched and then return to their original state. Okay, we can also smash them down, and then they expand back out when we release that pressure. These are known as the yellow fibers. Okay, and then lastly, we have what's called reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are thin and short, and they're actually made out of collagen, but they're just not as thick and heavy as those big collagen fibers. Okay, so collagen is a protein found both within reticular and collagen protein fibers. Okay, these are continuous with the collagen, the larger collagen fibers. They kind of form nets. Think of these kind of wrapping around organs and small blood vessels to kind of give support. Okay, and yeah. So take a second, see if you can answer this question. Pause it. Which protein fibers found in the connective tissue are not primarily made up of collagen protein? That was this one, because this one, elastin protein. Okay, so what about the cells? Those are the fibers. What about the cells in connective tissue? Okay, this is where you're going to need to start getting familiar with different prefixes and suffixes. Okay, so whenever you see blast in a word, okay, so these are the suffixes. Okay, so blasts are the ones that are actually making the extracellular matrix. These are the ones that are budding off the protein fibers. Okay, so fibroblasts, osteoblasts. Okay, osteo means bone. Fibro obviously just means fiber. Okay, so that's one suffix you need to understand and know that those blasts are the ones making the matrix. Okay, and then sites. Sites really just means cell. And so these are our cells that are maintaining the matrix, are always going to be there. And these are always going to have a prefix that tells you what type of tissue it is. Okay, so chondrocytes are cartilage, osteocytes are bone cells, adipocytes are fat cells. Okay, so those are the sites. And then we also always have immune cells scattered throughout connective tissue as well, macrophages, lymphocytes, and mast cells. Okay, so a quick little review. I would recommend that you pause your video right now and see if you can kind of run through this and kind of compare and contrast these characteristics of epithelial tissue, ET, versus connective tissue. Okay, so pause it, see how much you can walk through that, and then start it up and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so as far as cell to extracellular matrix go, epithelial tissue is almost all cells, right? This one is all matrix. And we'll say almost for both. Obviously, there is some matrix and some cells in each of them. Polarity, okay, only applies to epithelial tissue. That's the polarity of the cells. One side is the apical side, one side is the basal side. They're very different on both sides. The cells within connective tissue don't look like that. Vascularity in epithelial tissue is none. They're avascular. Connective tissue, it varies depending on the tissue, right? Degrees of vascularity is the way it's said. Proliferation, epithelial tissue is highly proliferative. It is constantly making more of itself, right? Replacing those dead cells. And then the functions, epithelial tissue covers, lines, and secretes, right? Because we got that glandular part of it too, whereas connective tissue responsible for structure, support, movement, of things around the body, the blood, right? Yeah, so those are the main functions of connective tissue. Okay, so one thing here, that all connective tissue starts as a single type of undifferentiated cell. When we think of the term stem cell, what that really means is a cell that could turn into any type of cell, right? And then there's kind of different cell lines that are just below stem cells. And so the type of stem cell that eventually is going to turn into all types of connective tissue is here. It's called mesenchyme, okay? And that's going to be our first tissue that you have to be able to recognize underneath connective tissue. Okay, and so this is just kind of looking at a mesenchymal stem cell. It turns into bone, cartilage, muscle, bone marrow, tendon, ligament, adipose tissue, connective tissue, right? So those mesenchymal cells start the whole process, okay? And this is what mesenchymal cells look like. So again, this is a series of slides that you're going to have to be able to recognize what they look like, know their functions, know the locations that we find these. Mesenchyme is embryonic tissue, right? It's from the embryo, okay, before those cells have differentiated, okay? Source of all connective tissue, they're kind of star-shaped, very fluid-like ground substance, okay? Very ground substance is really just space in that extracellular matrix. And then there's very fine protein fibrils. We see a little bit of that here. Okay, here's a little bit zoomed out view of mesenchyme. Okay, there it is again. Okay, next one is called areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue has kind of a more gel-like matrix, okay? The cells we find in there are fibroblasts, macrophages, and mast cells, as well as adipocytes, okay? The locations, we would find this underneath epithelial tissue. So this is part of that basement membrane that we're talking about, right? So very, very common type. This is the most abundant type of connective tissue in the body because it's underneath all of that epithelial tissue everywhere throughout the body, okay? We also find it around organs and capillaries. Its main functions are to act as a reservoir for salt and water so we can have some diffusion space. Why would we want diffusion space so close to epithelial tissue? Well, there's blood vessels in here, right? And there's no blood vessels up here, right? So we need the ability to diffuse oxygen through here so it can get to our tissue that doesn't have vascularity, right? This is also known as our universal packing material. Okay, here's what it looks like. So we see it in the skin here. This is kind of more of a drawing, and this is a microscope image. Okay, so we can see some big protein fibers, some collagen, some smaller protein fibers, and then lots of ground substance. Okay, and we can also see a few elastic fibers throughout. Okay, here's what it looks like as well under the microscope. Okay, moving on. Next one, this is called adipose tissue. It's also known as fat, right? The cells, this one is unique for connective tissue because the cells are super close to each other. They're very tightly packed. It has what's kind of called a chicken wire appearance, okay? And those cells are just packed with lipids, okay? So much so that the nucleus is just completely pushed to one side of the cell, okay? And so the cells don't grow, or they don't divide very often. They grow instead. They get larger. Main functions are energy storage, insulation, support, and protect organs. Obviously, we have subcutaneous adipose tissue, which is that's the fat underneath our skin. Also have it around many of our organs, including our kidneys and in the mammary glands. Okay, here's what it looks like. So it looks a lot more like epithelial tissue than it does connective tissue because it's pretty much all cells. What they say about adipose tissue is all that extracellular matrix you would normally have in connective tissue is just found inside the cells instead of outside. Here it is at high power. You can see that little tiny nucleus just totally pushed to the side of the cell. Okay, if you look at these two, then we're gonna go through a series of little questions like this. So it would be best if you just pause at each one, try to figure it out yourself, and then unpause. Okay, so which of these two is adipose tissue? Okay, let's take a look. So A is adipose, right? And what's B? That's our simple squamous epithelium. They look somewhat similar. Okay, next one's called reticular connective tissue. Characteristics of this is they're kind of those reticular fibers we were talking about in a web-like kind of net. Okay, there's also reticular cells, which are the fibroblasts of that connective tissue. And the functions of this are, again, to support soft tissue and organs and small blood vessels and kind of create this little bed for free blood cells in certain tissues that deal with blood a lot. And those tissues would be the spleen. The spleen is very important for developing red blood cells as well as developing some white blood cells. So there's a lot of blood cells just kind of need to get caught up in these nets. Lymph nodes are the home for most of our white blood cells, which are called our lymphocytes. That's what they're called that. And then the bone marrow is where blood cells are developed and released. And so we need this kind of special bed for blood cells. Here's what it looks like. So we'll see reticular fibers, and then we see lots of cells within. And these are going to be the cells that are actually being processed there, right? So we see that there, okay? Of these two, which one is reticular connective tissue? Pause for a second and see if you can figure it out. Okay, I'm gonna come back. So A is that areolar connective tissue we already looked at, and B is the reticular. Okay, moving on. The next one is called dense regular connective tissue, okay? All a strong matrix of parallel collagen fibers, okay? More collagen than elastin, but there's a little bit of elastin, definitely fibroblast. The key part is it has a parallel direction to it, okay? You can really see that in something like the Achilles tendon here, right? So very strong in one direction, okay? So that angle of pull in the Achilles tendon, very hard to tear it if you're just pulling straight, right? When you get in trouble is when you got a lot of tension on it and then you twist, right? And then you get some angle of pull going that way. It's not as good at withstanding force that direction. Okay, this is what makes up our ligaments and our tendons. Ligaments if you don't know yet, hold bone to bone, makes up our joints. Tendons hold muscle to bone. Okay, dense regular connective tissue looks like this. So you see lots of thick fibers all pretty much going in the same direction, and you see some fibroblasts scattered throughout. Okay, next one, dense irregular connective tissue. So much more wavy or swirled. Again, primarily fibroblasts are the main cell within. This one we have tensile strength in multiple directions, okay? So we think of something like what's called the joint capsule in our shoulder, okay? When we do things in our shoulder, like twist it back like this, okay, we need to be able to withstand force here in our joint capsule if we're coming straight back. But what about if we twist way back and then do that? Now we need to be able to withstand force here, and sometimes it's this way, sometimes it's this way, right? So those fibers, we don't want them all just going in one direction. We want them going every direction so we can withstand force in all those different directions, okay? So we have stretch resistance in multiple directions. We have this in our dermis, which is the layer of skin right below the epidermis, so it's connective tissue, and we have it in our joint capsules. Here's what it looks like. So somewhat similar to dense regular connective tissue, but much more wavy, right? Much more wavy, so lots of wavy lines, okay? So when we look at our skin, we see a few different layers here, okay? We see the A, B, and C here, okay? So this is our skin, all right? So A is going to be the epithelia part, okay? And then we have the part in the middle, which is going to be our ground substance, it's going to be the connective tissue that our epithelial tissue is anchored to, which is our areolar, connective tissue. And then we have our dense irregular down below that. And this is all part of the dermis. B and C are part of the dermis. We'll get to that more when we look at the skin coming up real soon. But we have epithelial tissue, and then we have that anchored by our areolar connective tissue, and then that's going to be below that is our dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, what about elastic connective tissue? It looks somewhat similar to the dense regular, except it's a little more wavy. And instead of collagen being the main protein, it's elastin. Okay, so it's very elastic. Its functions are to recoil after stretch. So we have these in the walls of our large arteries, like our aorta, right? The reason for that is kind of interesting. When our heart beats, it produces a bunch of pressure. It's going to stretch out the walls of that aorta. And then luckily, it's elastic, so it bounces back, right? When it bounces back, it pushes the blood along and keeps the blood's momentum up, okay? So when you feel your pulse in your artery, what you're feeling is that stretch that started all the way at the heart. So just think about that. The heart contracts, stretches out the aorta, and that pulse goes all the way through your whole vascular system, okay? All the way through the arterial side. And so that stretch is stretched out, and then it bounces back and keeps the blood moving rapidly. Okay, we also have this in the walls of our bronchial tubes that need to stretch when we take a big deep breath. Okay, here's what it looks like. It's very dense, kind of looks like dense regular, but it's more wavy, and it typically has a darker look to it like this. Okay, so pause it for a second, see if you can figure this one out. Which one's elastic connective tissue? So we see the dense regular, and then we see the elastic there. It's a little bit different look. You don't see cells as much on the elastic side. You do see some more cells on the regular side. Okay, let's dive into cartilage now. Okay, so the general characteristics of the different cartilage types are, number one, it's avascular. It doesn't have blood supply. And it also doesn't have innervation, doesn't have nervous system tissue going to it. Okay, chondrocytes, cartilage cells, are widely dispersed, and they're surrounded by something called lacuna, which is like a little cave for them to be in, pretty much hollow space. Okay, matrix is pretty solid, but it's not completely rigid like bone. It can stand up to tension and compression, mostly collagen, and it's actually a lot of water. Very important that your cartilage is hydrated or else it starts falling apart. And it's always going to be connected to bone. Okay, first type is called hyaline cartilage. This is the type of cartilage that, for one of the places you find it, is inside of our joints, at the end of our long bones, also known as articular cartilage. We find this in our growth plates, in our connection from our ribs to our sternum, it's called our costal cartilage, in the nose and in the trachea. Okay, so the matrix of this kind of almost looks transparent. Okay, there's a few little chondrocytes and lacuna, you'll see those. And so the functions of this are, it's very rigid, very smooth, but it's still a little bit flexible, okay? It forms the embryonic skeleton. So that could be a location or a function really, right? But the embryonic skeleton is all hyaline cartilage, it's not bone yet. And so another function is related to those growth plates. It allows for growth of long bones. Here's what it looks like. We can see that kind of smooth, almost transparent looking ground substance or extracellular matrix, and then those chondrocytes and lacuna. And you can see that here. See the space around the cell? That's the lacuna. Okay, you can see hyaline cartilage there. Again, you can see this one's kind of wrapping around a curve in a bone. Okay, next one's called elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is similar to hyaline, but it also contains elastin fibers. Okay, you can see a lot more fibers than the hyaline cartilage. Very strong, but also very flexible. Okay, and it's very important for maintaining its shape. Okay, so the external ear is made of this, as well as the epiglottis, the thing that covers up your respiratory tract when you swallow. Here's what it looks like. So we can see those chondrocytes and lacuna, and then we can see fibers between, so much more fibrous than the hyaline cartilage was. There it is. Okay, next one's called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage, we have these big, thick bundles of collagen fibers. So you see a lot more fibers. Again, chondrocytes. These are very good for compression forces. Okay, so forces just smashing them down. Also good tensile strength. We find these in our intervertebral discs between our vertebrae, right? Articular discs, like our meniscus in our knee. We talked about that one up in our joint, up in our jaw. That's an articular disc. And also our pubic symphysis, where those two os coxa come together on the anterior side. Here's what it looks like. So much, many less cells and many more fibers, very fibrous looking. Okay, there's fibrocartilage. Okay, so the three cartilage types, which one's which? Pause it for a second, see if you can identify these, or three of the cartilage types, and then unpause. Okay, so we see that. So fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage, and hyaline cartilage. All right, getting close to the end here. Bone is the predominant tissue of the skeleton, right? It's extremely vascular, okay? It has osteocytes surrounded by lacuna. Okay, so the osteocytes are the bone cells. The matrix is made up of two primary components. It has calcium phosphate, that's salt, or the inorganic portion, and then collagen, which is the organic portion, which gives it some flexibility. We'll have a whole couple sections on bone. We'll get more into that. But for now, you can just kind of see what it looks like. So very distinct, doesn't really look like anything else. So you can easily tell what it looks like. Okay, and then lastly, bone or blood. Blood, its characteristics are about half of its volume is cells. Okay, there are some fibrous proteins throughout. It's moving, which is different than the other tissues, right? But it is mostly fluid, but it can turn into a jelly-like substance when it needs to clot, right? So the functions, it transports gases, nutrients, wastes, and hormone wastes. And so we find this obviously in the cardiovascular system. And that's what it looks like. Pretty simple to tell, blood. Okay, and then lastly here, as we transition away from epithelial tissue and connective tissue, there's one part of our body that brings these two, another part of our body that brings these two tissues together. And this is known as our membranes, okay? We have lots of covering and lining membranes, okay? And they're always composed of epithelium and connective tissue layer. Okay, and there's three main types in the body. There's what's called the cutaneous, which is our skin. There's the serous, which are these moist membranes that line closed cavities. And we'll talk about those a little more in a sec. And then mucous membranes. And these line all body cavities that open up to the outside. There's the examples there. Okay, so let's look at those serous membranes in a little bit more detail. Serous membranes have two separate surfaces within them, okay? Two separate layers, really. And so the visceral side is the side that's closer to the organs, okay? And then there's a parietal side that's closer to the outside of it, away from the organ, okay? And so the layers within each of those now, so now within the visceral, there's two layers. Within the parietal, there's also two layers, okay? And between the visceral and the parietal layers is a fluid-filled space called the serous fluid. Okay, and this serves as a lubricant for organs that move a lot. Okay, so we find these around our lungs, our heart, our digestive tract, because those things move all the time. We need this nice fluid-filled space around to cut down on friction and let those organs move. Okay, so this is an example in the lungs, the mesothelium, and if you've heard of mesothelioma, which happens when people are exposed to asbestos too much, that's damage to the serous membrane. We also have one around our heart, known as a pericardium. Okay, that's so our heart can contract back and forth and move and have that nice resistance to friction. Okay, a couple more. We see serosal membranes around the lungs, around the heart, around the abdominal cavity, like I said. And we can see that here, up here in where the heart is, this one up here, we see there's two, right? We see this fluid-filled space, which is the pericardial cavity, and we have the parietal layer right here, right? And then we have the visceral layer right here, right? So there's two separate layers. Both the parietal layer and the visceral layer contain epithelial tissue and connective tissue. And so we have that on both sides, and then that fluid-filled space in the middle. All right, guys, that wraps us up. We'll see you soon.